Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this morning's seminars featuring our graduate students, starting with, of course, Saajid Hosein. Hi, Saajid. It's a pleasure to have you here on this Friday morning, and we expect that we will have a lively discussion of the work that these students have been pursuing over some time. And of course, it is both insightful, reflective, and I dare say, potentially revolutionary work. We have this morning first Saajid Hosein. He will be discussing for his MPhil Muslim men versus Muslim masculinity, interrogating ideals of Muslim masculinity among Indo-Trinidadian Muslim men. His supervisor is Dr. Gabrielle Hosein. How we will proceed this morning, we will first have Saajid present his work for about 20-25 minutes. Then we will turn to comments from his assessors. His first assessor is Professor Patricia Mohammed. Thank you, Professor, for agreeing to examine Saajid. We expect that you'll have very useful comments, and I will be his second assessor and will give him some feedback as well. I'm also a member of his advisory committee. So without much ado, we want to thank all of you. We want to also thank the head of IGDS, Dr. Gabrielle Hosein, and his supervisor, and all of our colleagues, both students and other members of the university. We recognize you and your presence.
Okay, so
Saajid,
I'll start now. Good morning to Professor Patricia Mohammed, to Dr. Suan Barrett, to Dr. Gabrielle Hosein, and everyone else present here today. Thank you so much for taking interest in attending the first graduate seminar for my MPhil thesis. So, ideals and notions of masculinity constitute an integral aspect of gender in the Indo-Trinidadian Muslim community. It is important to note that these ideals and notions do not exist within a vacuum, but are the product of a very complex and dynamic history. The literature on the Indo-Muslim experience has explored the specificities of gender in the community to a considerable extent. And one of the main themes emerging surrounds the historical shifts and changes that have occurred within the community over time. These shifts have come to play a significant role in the shaping of gender ideologies and relations among Muslims of Indian descent. What is not present in the scholarship to a sufficient enough extent, however, is the construction of Indo-Muslim masculinities within this historical trajectory, especially as it relates to contemporary masculinities. This is where my work comes in. I contend that my study will be filling a gap by specifically focusing on the construction of masculinities within the community and how the history of that construction impacts its more modern manifestations. I'm also interested in situating my work within the wider global conversations on Muslim masculinities, as I believe it can offer a unique perspective to this framework. My aim, therefore, is to produce transformative knowledge about Indo-Trinidadian Muslim men's subjectivity and contribute that to the fields of Indo-Caribbean feminisms and masculinities studies. The overall purpose of my study is to examine the ways in which Indo-Trinidadian Muslim men conceptualize, negotiate, and perform their masculine identities at the intersection of their faith, ethnicity, and nationality. With all of this in consideration, the research questions guiding my study are as follows. How has the history of the Indo-Muslim community in Trinidad shaped Muslim men's contemporary idea of what it means to be a Muslim man? How has Indo-Muslim masculinity been constructed within the framework of religion and racialized ethnicity? And how do global conceptions and images of Islam affect local Indo-Muslim men's way of being? Starting off with my conceptual frame. The concepts I intend to utilize for now in my research are masculinity, ethno-nationalism, purity, and piety. And I'm presenting them in this order because I believe that they build off of each other. Masculinity refers to the socially constructed gendered behaviors of men mediated by factors such as ethnicity, race, religion, within respective historical and cultural contexts. The key word here being constructed. Generally, notions and relations of gender are justified by essentialism and therefore seen as natural. Masculinity thus becomes an unquestionable disciplinary power, justified by nature and thereby depoliticizing its reality. Barry Chavans notes that gender is a system of prestige, prestige being the connection and access to resources. In our society, men's ability to maintain prestige over women is central to the construction and maintenance of masculinity, because gender is ultimately a system of power. Masculinity is the most foundational concept in my research, and thus is connected to all three of my questions, which are concerned about how Indo-masculinity is constructed, especially in relation to these cultural and historical factors. My second concept is ethno-nationalism. In plural societies, various communities bound by separate ethnic labels share a collective consciousness where the highest loyalty of the citizen is to the solidarity group and not the state. This consciousness can be understood as ethno-nationalist and informs the ways in which various groups within the state negotiate for power. Anne McClintock notes that nationalism derives from masculinized memory, hope, and humiliation. She also contends that national power is incumbent upon the existence and enforcement of gender difference. Rhoda Reddock further argues that gender and sexuality and ethnicity were integral in the legislation of various marriage acts in 20th century Trinidad, which derived from efforts by male-led nationalist groups. And an important aspect of these marriage acts was the institutionalization of male power and women's subordination. This concept is heavily connected to my second question, which asks how masculinity is constructed within the framework of racialized ethnicity. Well, masculinity depends on ethno-nationalist community building in order to establish its legitimacy as a category of power. Purity is my third concept. Within plural societies, the definition of ethnic and religious boundaries, is extremely important, and purity plays an integral role in defining such boundaries for the Indo-Muslim community. According to Aisha Khan, discourses of purity for Indo-Muslims speak to the desire to establish the practice of a pure Islam, one that is shorn of additives and embellishments that make it less authentic. This means ensuring that older Indian Muslim practices that were understood as syncretic with Hinduism and cultural wider symbols associated with Creole society are seen as incompatible with proper Islamic practice. Purity also has implications for masculinity and femininity, as maintaining an authentic practice of faith would inevitably mean conforming to prescribed notions of manhood and womanhood. Piety refers to the commitment to these puritanical principles. It's about consciously ensuring that one's daily life and practices are imbued with religious purpose and intent, not just merely habitual or customary. Saba Mahmood notes that among the more religiously devout in Egypt, there is the perception that secularization is eroding Islam to a kind of Muslim folklore and reducing it to customs and conventions. Those concerned with this ensure that they remain both inwardly and outwardly committed to a proper Islamic practice. This also has implications for gender, as Mahmood notes that the Muslim women she studied would engage in performative acts of piety, such as dressing modestly, praying consistently, and ensuring that their performance of womanhood is aligned with conventional Islamic dictates. Purity and piety are integral to all three of my questions, but especially the third. This question is concerned with how global Islam impacts local constructions. Well, as we will learn from the literature review, the introduction of orthodoxy from global influences would come to, over time, shape notions of purity and piety amongst Indo-Muslims in Trinidad. I also feel like piety might be a useful concept in exploring the first question, especially with respect to contemporary Muslim masculinity. How does piety look for Muslim men, and how do they embody and perform it? So, as established, the concepts that I have chosen were presented in this order because they build off of each other. Masculinity is inevitably linked to ethno-nationalism. Purity is a huge part of ensuring ethnic boundaries for ethno-nationalist groups. And piety largely refers to or has a lot to do with the commitment to puritanical principles. So they all build off of each other. So I kind of did this diagram to illustrate that. So, literature review. There are two main components in my literature review. Firstly, I'll be examining the literature on the historical development of the Indo-Muslim community to highlight what the scholarship offers in the conceptualization and institutionalization of gender, and more particularly masculinity amongst Indo-Muslims. I also intend to review the literature on global Muslim and Islamic masculinities, as I'm interested in understanding what the global perspectives on the conversation of masculinity among Muslim men are and how they impact local discourse. So in my historical analysis, I start off firstly with the indentureship period. And I am using works by people like Kelvin Singh's Muharram Massacre, Gayatri Bahadur's Coolie Woman, and other works from other writers like Rhoda Reddock, Patricia Mohammed, and Bridget Barrett. Some of the notable things that happened during this time that are often cited in the literature include, first of all, the Muharram Massacre of 1884, where Muharram celebrations were met with gunfire by colonial elites. These celebrations were male-led, Muslim Indian male-led, so to suppress such demonstrations by men who were already marginalized could have been seen as emasculating. Further, during indentureship, we saw an increase in Indian men's violence towards Indian women, and that was largely because of the disruption of traditional Indian village life by the indentureship system. And on top of all of this, Indian men also had to compete with other patriarchies in the colony, the elite white patriarchy, the populous Afro-Creole patriarchy, and Indian masculinity was therefore in a state of crisis and in need of reestablishment, as they were not able to attain the level of prestige and power over women that they needed. So remember that nationalism derives from masculinized memory, humiliation, and hope. This would come into play in the next historical period where Indian men would begin this process of reestablishing traditional Indian patriarchy. And that brings us to the post-indenture pre-independence era. So in this section, I examine the literature on the reconstruction of the Indo-Muslim community after indentureship as a patriarchal endeavor. I am citing mainly Patricia Mohammed, Gender Negotiations Among Indians in Trinidad, Halima Qasim's PhD thesis, and other works by Qasim Mohammed and Rhoda Reddock. So one of the first themes emerging in the literature during this time was the continued different trajectories taken on by Islam and Hinduism. This is likely due to missionary activity from the Middle East and South Asia, which brought ideologies that conflicted with syncretic traditional Islamic and Hindu practices. And here we see a connection with purity. Also, there was the 1947 partition of India, which became a Hindu state, potentially weakening Indo-Muslims' ties to the homeland. This is where ethno-nationalism comes back into play. There was an increased need for Indo-Muslims to distinguish their community among other ethno-religious communities within the state. One of their biggest causes for recognition was the legislation of the Muslim Marriage and Divorce Act of 1935. Reddock asserts that marriage was an important symbol for male dominance and group difference, and the establishment of this act was an opportunity to achieve that for Indo-Muslim men. The post-indentureship, pre-independence era. So this time period saw notable institutional development. This is the same time period. An example of this was, according to Halima Qasim, was the development of masjids, which were major socializing agents and patriarchal spaces for men. Also, organizations like the TIA and ASJA were established during this time period, and they were invested in furthering the ethno-nationalist cause of the Indo-Muslims as well. So in this section, I examine the literature's continued exploration of the community in the post-colonial period. And I look at works from Reddock, Mohammed, Qasim in various edited collections and other works as well, like Aisha Khan's Kalalu Nation. So one of the main focuses in the literature on this period is the new wave of orthodoxy that played a significant role in shifting gender relations in the Indo-Muslim community. This came in the form of a global movement in the 1970s, sometimes referred to as Islamization, which aimed to secure a cultural homogenization of Islam. Two key aspects of this movement were firstly, the eradication of innovative or syncretic traditions in Islamic communities worldwide, and we could see a connection with purity here again. And secondly, the privileging of androcentric interpretations of the Quran as unquestionable. Remember that we discussed about masculinity being constructed as an unquestionable disciplinary power. This can be exemplified in the reinforcement of the masjid as a masculinized space. Rhoda Reddock notes that during this time, masjids began putting up partitions between the women and men section, even reduced women's participation in their administration. We can also see the movement's influence in outward gendered performances of piety. Qasim notes that the hijab emerged during this time period. And for Muslim men, Muhammad notes that the beard, for instance, has become an important symbol of manhood and piety among men. This makes me question what other ways of piety or commitment to an authentic, purposeful practice of Islam requires men to prove and perform their commitment to their faith. Also to note is that these outward signifiers of piety have become symbols of the religion's difference in establishing a collective identity and space within the plural matrix. So speaking of, the scholarship also highlights the development of Indo-Muslims' relations with other ethno-religious bodies at this time. Islam and Hinduism would continue their separate paths. The Afro-Muslim community would begin to emerge and do so on a separate path as well from the Indo-Muslim community because of different ethno-religious interests. And Indo-Muslim associations like the ASJA would continue to define and facilitate Indo-Muslim men's negotiation with other patriarchies, while barring women's ability to do so. I would be happy to further discuss some of this in the question and answer section. The final portion of my literature review is still largely a work in progress. Nevertheless, I will share what I intend to do with it. I want to situate the Indo-Trinidadian Muslims within the wider global conversation on Islam, and I believe that global influences have significantly contributed to the shaping of masculinity amongst Indo-Muslim men. One insightful work that I've read is Maliha Aslam's Gender-Based Explosion. Her main argument is that when studying why Muslim men are usurped into terrorist and Islamic networking, there must be a rigorous analysis of how gender is implicated. Essentially, she argues that gender shapes men's understanding of how they are implicated in circumstances that they experience and how they should respond. Her use of gender in this analysis is key, as she understands the importance when researching Muslim communities of gender. Indo-Muslims have determined that there are ideal and authentic ways to be a proper Muslim because in part of global influences, and gender becomes a major agent in mediating belonging to the Muslim world. Ultimately, I'm also interested in contributing to the global literature on Muslim masculinities while offering a unique perspective, one of an older diasporic community that is very contextually different from writings coming out about Muslim communities in the East and global North. So methodology. In order to critically reflect on myself and my relation to subject participants throughout the research process, I employ a feminist research ethic as prescribed by Ackley and True. This has prompted me to locate myself within the context of my research and contemplate how my likeness as a young, educated, middle-class Indo-Trinidadian Muslim who is gendered male affects my assumptions about and relationships with my subject participants, subsequently the ways in which I will produce knowledge. There are some considerations that I have to make in selecting my sample. I want to look at men from different age groups, as I think that this could be an opportunity to see what generational differences might exist among Muslim men. I also want to engage with Muslim male leaders and Jamaat members, key Jamaat members, since they are the ones who are looked upon with reverence as knowledge sources in the community. I'm also thinking to use focus groups to engage with young Muslim men from the ages of 18 to 25 or so in a group of maybe 5 to 10. I'm still deciding about numbers and stuff like that. Interviews to speak, I want to use interviews to speak to imams and figureheads, maybe around 3 to 5, and a more general engagement with Muslim men through digital ethnography. I also think that I should account for differences across class, race, geography, sect, etc. Not race, sorry, but class, geography, sect, and other intersectional factors. So the first method that I will be employing is archiving. Archives are invaluable sources of information and knowledge since no contemporary issue exists in a vacuum. Since my research is heavily based in understanding historical shifts in masculinity among Indo-Trinidadian Muslims, newspapers and archives could allow me to decode conversations, stories, and ideologies of Muslim men who produced content in the past. So while literature and theory on Indo-Caribbean Muslim masculinity might be scarce, Muslim men themselves have historically engaged in communication and expression which could be the subject of some feminist interpretation and analysis. I also plan to use focus groups and interviews. An interview is a one-on-one conversation with a subject participant for the purpose of gleaning information about their lives as it relates to the topic of study. And focus groups are a type of interview that is group-based. The main reason why I want to conduct interviews is so that I can speak interpersonally with imams and Muslim male figureheads, as I mentioned before. I want to conduct individual interviews with them so that I can have ample time to understand where they are coming from and what their thoughts on masculinity are. I just think that interviews will be the most appropriate way to communicate with them. I want to utilize focus groups for my study on young Muslim men. I think that this would be an interesting opportunity to engage with them as a community and observe how they interact with each other and share knowledge through asking them direct questions. Focus groups also provide the opportunity for retrospective introspection, where they explore aspects of assumptions about their lives that they have taken for granted. Digital ethnography. Digital ethnography is the part of my methodology that I'm still largely trying to figure out. Ethnographic research methods attempt to study social life in real time by avoiding artificial research settings. Ethnographers depend primarily on observation, usually focusing on one case study. And obviously with the pandemic, I have to switch up my initial plan to do a regular ethnography. Instead, I will be employing a digital ethnography where I would have to approach researching virtual spaces as their own distinct spaces and understanding how they impact participants in the physical world. For the work to be ethnographic, it must involve participant observation as opposed to simple interviews or online surveys. This comes with its own challenges, as I must figure out what online platforms are used by young Indian Muslim men in Trinidad and come up with a plan to engage in those platforms as a participant observer. So this is something that I'm still working through. So to conclude, there are some further considerations that I want to make, that I'm still thinking about, that I'm still developing on in my work. So I think that there definitely needs to be more focus on intra-religious community difference, not just in terms of class and race and stuff like that, but also in terms of sectoral differences, because there's an understanding that the Ahmadiyya sect of Islam, which is a smaller sect among Indo-Muslims, is more progressive, and that might lead to different conceptualization of masculinity across different sects. I'm still figuring out my sampling, selection, numbers, places, spaces, especially online spaces that I could engage with for data collection. Obviously, I still have to do much more reading on global literature on Muslim masculinities. And what I'm thinking about doing for my literature review as well is kind of, instead of having a separate section for global literature, incorporating it into the different historical periods and seeing how, well, in the 1970s and 80s, what was going on globally and connecting that one time with what happened locally. I want to be mindful of how I use concepts across boundaries like purity and piety. These are concepts that were largely, especially piety, conceptualized by Mahmoud in relation to women, and I'm using it in relation to men. So I have to be mindful about how I move these concepts across boundaries, as purity and piety would inevitably look different and the standards would be different for men. I want to account eventually for more queer Muslim masculinity, because heteronormativity and homophobia are a huge part in the construction of masculinity. Compulsory heterosexuality is a part of ethno-nationalism. And obviously, being heterosexual and not being queer is extremely important for maintaining conventional notions of purity and piety. So it's very related to my work, and I definitely want to go back and incorporate that more. And as I said, global literature, and that is it for my presentation.
Thank you very much, Saajid. That was a very thorough presentation. Congratulations. And you worked very well with time. I turn over the floor to Professor Mohammed to give you some comments, feedback, questions. Prof?
Thank you very much, Dr. Barrett and colleagues. Let me first begin by saying to, may I call him Sajid?
Saajid, yeah.
Sajid. Right, it's easier than trying to say your whole name.
That's fine.
And I see we share part of a name as well. First of all, let me congratulate you on not only a very well written proposal, paper, but also a very detailed, well laid out piece of research.
Thank you.
The paper is very logically constructed. I found it was very easy to read it through and to grasp immediately what you've intended to do, and so on. So in fact, you do a lot of that thought process on the paper itself by telling the reader constantly that you're doing X, Y, and Z. And some of that you may edit out at the end.
Mm-hmm.
That's useful as a first draft,
Yeah.
And you have a very logical way of thinking through. So I think you'll have no problems doing an MPhil or a PhD for that matter, which I'll come to later. All right, so that's the first thing I want to say. And I also liked your research questions. I thought they not only dealt with the past as a delving into the past, but it actually brings it up quite contemporary reading in a way that makes sense for the modern world. And therefore it allows us to see that in fact, as a thesis, what is going to be very valuable in the global sense is what you come out with in that third section. The first two questions would be very important as the build up to that. So when you are doing it, you'd realize where you place the emphasis and the kinds of research, especially those last points you were dealing with about pure focus groups and your sampling and so on. So you might weight that in favor of that. But I certainly think, the kinds of data you look at will answer some of the previous questions.
Okay.
So the questions, I think, I couldn't be critical about them because I can see them working logically in flow with each other and allowing you to build up chapters that also logically deal with the data that you are uncovering. So that's the other point. Though this is just one point on the literature review. It was extensive, and you certainly don't need to continually acknowledge who you are quoting. At the beginning, you just say, I'm looking at 3 sets of literature from, historians, and then you go into them. So as a way of editing yourself next time. This is good for a first thing, but and when you do write the final thing, you'll be working for more elegance in writing. And you split up the kinds of literature you're looking at and the various resources, and then you go into it and sectionize that perhaps. But I thought to add to your archival research, I don't know if you've done this already, you may have, but I know, for instance, that when you look at newspaper research, what I used to come across a lot is the work by people like F.E.M. Hosein and C.C. Ahmed, people who are very dominant Muslim characters, Islamic characters. I think you're going to have to select them and pursue them a bit more to see how they began shaping this discourse. Because you had Sipasad Naipaul writing, or you had C.B. Mathura. I don't know if C.B. Mathura was a Hindu. Can't even remember. It might have been Hindu. But you would need to look at the group of men who emerged as the early men who defended the Indo-Caribbean, Indo ethno-nationalism. For instance, in 1910, when they had to be represented at the Sanderson Committee,
right,
which is a defense of indentureship or not, or otherwise. Who were the men represented? I know F.E.M. Hosein was there. So those kinds of people. In fact, moving forward, Tajmul Hussein becomes an interesting character to look at as well, because he becomes one of the first Queen's Counsel silk lawyer, and he had a great deal to do with the background. You didn't hear a lot about him, but he's a very informative man. The second point that I want, have you looked at those 2 characters in Anthony Devatai's 8 East Indian Families?
I did briefly read part of the chapter on Ruknuddin, I think is his name, and I found him fascinating because he was kind of like one of the first examples of somebody sort of bringing in kind of like a more correct Islamic practice kind of institute locally, right?
Yeah, I think when you're building up that archival base,
Mm-hmm.
it's like Gokul and Ruknuddin, those
Okay.
characters, their life stories or whatever you elicit from them in
Right.
terms of your data. And I certainly think what it would do is when you are establishing your literature review, I don't know if you're going to deal with this as another chapter, but certainly within the literature review, you already emerge with ethnographic insights,
Mm-hmm.
flavor the reading of the review of the literature. So
Okay.
you're not, you're already beginning to get the kinds of insights and pointing to the justifying why piety, purity, all those points you emerge with are actually going to be very, again, emerging from what you are finding. So there's a logic to what I'm saying about looking at these characters within the literature review.
Okay.
Other thing, another source that I don't know if, and I want to congratulate, I should have started by congratulating your supervisor, Dr. Hosein, for giving you such good guidance. Clearly, the guidance here is also important. I don't know if she sent you to the Caribbean Studies theses, and if they are available to students now. I know you can make appointments and go to West Indiana, which I have done, but have a look at the Caribbean Studies thesis, and there you would find work, for instance, on people who wrote about Shah Muhammad, Kamaluddin Muhammad.
Right.
You find very odd little papers, but they always very insightful. When I was doing my PhD, in fact, some of those Caribbean Studies theses were some of the most insightful because they were little vignettes and glimpses that would be written by a student which would be based on a village or whatever. And those are, I think you'll find a few that might be useful.
Okay.
Nasa Abdul might, is Nasa, what is his name? Mustafa, sorry. Might be a useful resource here as well to go to because NASA has written extensively on this. So if you haven't gone to NASA yet, you need to have a session with him.
Yeah.
Asking guidance. Yeah. All right. This the third question, and Suan, I'm sorry if I'm taking long. I just did a few notes, but this was such a fascinating piece of work that it got me thinking a lot. So, I like Professor Reddock's point about the legislation and importance of that as framing an ethno-nationalism. And I think here you're talking at the end about having an intersectionality that actually dealt with other religious customs.
Right.
And I think here there's a point at which a comparison between why Islam and Muslims were able to have the Muslim marriage and divorce bill passed in 1935, and the Hindus didn't get their act together until 45.
Right.
The same thing for education. If you look at education, Islam schools were already being set up from the early 1920s and so on, if not before. There was a spate of schools. The Astra and I don't know which other sects began to set up schools, whereas the Hindus didn't get their schools together until the 50s. And I think that framing of the marriage, the legislation, and the education are two important ways to actually find a pinhole into ethno-nationalism.
Okay.
And why maybe Muslims, a smaller group to organize clearly than the Hindus, which are much less, but also why that separation. I know, for instance, the passage of because by that time they had begun to get the Hajis who were coming direct from Middle East and beginning to influence them. So there are all kinds of reasons, but I certainly think that would give you a really sound way of connecting it and identifying I think not just ethno-nationalism, but I think also identifying the difference in the patriarchal construct that they were developing. Remember, I grew up as a Muslim with a household of Islamic peoples and so on. So I'm going back to a sense of really how it was being constructed, all these elders and so on. And I think that root came from there. So, so I would say that that would be a place. The other thing I thought, the panchayats, although we've left it out so far, it might be useful to look at the panchayats to see within the construction of the early panchayats, did they include Muslim men or was it largely Islamic? I think there you'd find that who they would take is the authorities in the village, which would be either the priests, the pundits, or the imam. So I think that we would find and in fact, what it would tell us, and this is the contradiction of patriarchy, it would tell us that even while they're defining an ethno-nationalism that was uniquely about Islam, there were many bridges being crossed, also create what comes out in my work, which is that there's a larger Indian community that's being constructed.
Right.
There are these alliances that have also been made. So it will clarify that point. So the panchayat, I think, useful. We talked about education. Now, I like the point about education for another reason. Education tells you a lot about what the contradictions, again, with regard to Indian, to the education of Muslim women. And Halima brings out that a lot in her thesis.
Right.
And when I started to look at who emerged as the first feminist in the Trinidad, people were writing, who were studying, researching, and whatever, and who were part of that education tradition. I saw myself, Shahida Hussein, Halima Qasim, Gabrielle Hussein. Without a doubt, we were the forerunners in it, in the Islamic sense, and predated a lot of Hindu women who, a lot of them went into, say, journalism and so on, yet we became the scholars. And I think that tradition of both allowing women that freedom,
yes,
for education, but still repressing it we come back to purity and piety. I think that contradiction of Islam is a really important one to pull out, because I think there's no patriarchy without benevolence of some sort. And just dealing with that is not to agree with patriarchy, but to understand patriarchy in its full essence.
right.
I certainly was a product of that, so I understand that very well. My father was one of the most important persons in guiding and supporting our education fully. And there was no differences made between boys and girls.
Right.
So I saw that in all my my aunts and so on. So definitely pursue that a bit in terms of understanding patriarchy.
There's even the example of Anisa Ahmed, right, for the Ahmadiyya, where they allowed her to give a khutbah, I think sometime in the 1990s. And it caused a lot of controversy, but it was very interesting because they kind of made room for a woman to deliver a sermon.
Exactly. And not until the late 90s into the 20th century do you see the first Pandita Indrani being created. So if you think about that as a forerunner, and when I was a child, I remember when those Hajis visited, I remember being taken with lots of women, and we'd be exposed to what he was saying. So there was a real attempt to bring women in and not leave women out all the time.
Right.
As far as the exposure, of course, how they pulled in the web again is another story. But right, so moving on. Sorry, Dr. Barrett. I'm getting there. I like your. I liked that. It's just a general point, but I like the point that you made when you said on page whatever, there's insufficient scholarship on the construction of Muslim masculinities, especially relates to contemporary masculinities. Is a really nice sentence to work with as you play it out, because why is this insufficiency, and why is it that and why that is important is because Islam then becomes so important by the 20th century. Sorry, by the late into the global Islam.
Yes.
It connects back why it was not and why it is, why it therefore became. So there's a way in which I think the connection is important. I can't figure it out yet, but I saw that while I was reading your paper. The next point is with respect to purity and piety. And these are 2 points, and I'm going to go to your paper here and give me a second to find it. It's on page, I don't think your paper is paginated, eh?
Oh,
Then you mustn't do that. That's always a difficult issue to
my bad. My apologies.
never forget that when you're sending out stuff. Um,
No.
not above summer, just a reminder, because
Yeah.
you kind of run the risk of other things. All right, so on page 21 and mine, because I used up your front page, I did this thing. I began to look at something that I thought was very interesting. Now, the concepts of purity and piety, for me, for Muslims, it can be pitted against purity and pollution for Hindus.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is where, again, the religious, the definition of a different religious construct is being made to separate what is Muslim, what is Islamic, from what is Hindu. Now, remember the idea of, Islam, the idea of Hinduism is that pollution created caste endogamy.
Mm-hmm.
So, what was the value of purity and piety for Muslims?
Right.
And how did this define Islam as different from Hinduism?
Right.
How does create? And I think it's very central. I think they are really two good concepts to use. And when you think about it in relation to women, in Islam, the concept of fitna as it relates to Islamic women compared to the concept of prakti and shakti as it relates to Hindu women, it creates very different spaces. So there was a way in which the control of Muslim women had to pull in purity and piety, which differentiated them. But in addition to that, the purity and the honor of Islamic men was vested in the honor, in the virtue of women.
Right.
So you had to have the virtue of women in order to have to maintain your purity, your what was Islamic. It still obtains, by the way. I see it no differently now. So it's a really lasting. I think it operates throughout.
Definitely.
So pursue that with a little more comparison, and it would pull out more what is Islam. It's like the dialectic of it. By doing the one, you actually sharpen the other. And I think right. The last thing I would say, and I let her, I'll leave her this talk, but there are a few points I may come back to, but I don't want to bore you. I could send all this thing to you. The last thing I would say is, you see the concept of ethno-nationalism.
Mm-hmm.
When you start to deal with it, I want you to claim it after a while. Don't just take anybody else's definition of it.
Mm-hmm.
Start with a definition, but also claim it in terms of how you are defining it at the end. Because when you are, as you come to your last point about the global, it will also have that trajectory of where you will see its importance or lack of importance.
Right.
I think there's another thread that you have to pull through there. So I'll end there. I thought you left it open ended with the sampling and so on, and I agree. At this point, you were in the stage where you needed to work that through a bit more. So I found, again, to repeat, that it is really a nice body of work, and congrats again to both of you.
Thank you for that, Professor Mohammed. Appreciate it.
All right.
Thank you very much Prof, for your detailed and valuable comments. Lots of insights for you, Saajid, in terms of your literature and what you need to cover. I will keep my comments brief. I can send it to you afterwards. I would just say that since your questions do explore the how from multiple angles, it would be very interesting for you to really contemplate how you're going to bring these historical influences into the contemporary relevant to your sample, how you get then going to use the multiple methods you've identified to gather information about certain things. So your focus group. So what do you prime your respondents with? Or if you don't prime them whatsoever and you allow them to make things relevant, and we can talk further. I like the idea of a digital ethnography and entering that space, and how you do that then will, I would suggest, should be informed by the information you gather from other methods of collection, and then you kind of put them in that space so that you test what that how of your question, because my ultimate thing is how do you then access or explore the how that you wish to elaborate. But I'll keep it out there because we only have about 12 minutes and I do want to open the floor to the community, starting with our colleagues, your supervisor, Dr. Nixon, Dr. McPhil, I see on, and then generally all who are here. What I would suggest is that you may comment or you may put your question in the chat, and then we will give Saajid an opportunity to respond since we have such a brief amount of time. So,
can I just make one point before you start? Just 1 second, and then you're not hearing from me again. This is of the digital. It is, let me tell you, I've been doing research for biography now, and all my research is being done digitally, and it is a wonder.
Yes.
You can tape Zoom interviews. You can get people on focus groups and tape them as well.
Yes.
And so don't be daunted by it. It is actually a very, very good method to save time on research. That's me.
Yeah, an excellent platform. So let me hear from Dr. Hosein, brief comments, Dr. Nixon, and then the floor.
Just to say congratulations, Saajid. We will follow up on all comments. I'll reserve anything I have to say until after, and I'm excited to hear what others contribute to the session. Congratulations, Saajid.
Thanks, Dr. Hosein.
Dr. Nixon?
Hi, everyone. Saajid, this was so excellent. I just want to say congratulations as well. And I'm super excited and really, I'm just, watching your work grow over the last year and in coursework and what I've gotten to read. I can see how much you've worked. Your literature review is so excellent, how you present your ideas. And I'm really excited about your methodology and your approaches and how you've been able to switch it up. So, just really, I hope that you are feeling as proud and excited as you should be. Good. And I'm also really, the digital ethnography sounds super exciting. And yeah, I just want to give you encouragement. And if there's any support I can offer, just let me know.
Definitely. Thank you, Dr. Nixon.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nixon. I would also like to encourage everyone, if you are not able to speak within our time, please put your question or comments in the chat so Saajid could benefit from this after we complete. Is there anyone who would like to share a comment or question with Saajid? Just raise your hand and or put your mic on if it's not packed. And I don't see any hands raised. Any comments or questions? Saajid, while we wait for comments, actually there is one. Vinay Harichan is saying, forgive me if you addressed it already, but just curious to know if you will be examining the roles of and perceptions toward Indo-Trinidadian men within politics from the emerging Indo-Trinidadian politicians in the 1960s onward. Muslim men.
Yeah, thank you, Vinay. That's definitely something that I think that I haven't really looked into it too much as yet, but I know that there are some key figures like Muhammad and Sham Muhammad and whoever. So I think that that is definitely something that I will look into more. So thank you for bringing that up.
Thank you, Saajid. As we wait for anyone else to share their point of view in the oh yes, we have another view from Amilka. Thank you, Amilka. He says to you, good work and love from this end, of course. I like how you're taking up the concept of ethno-nationalism, and it would be interesting to see how you examine the way it is being oriented by different scholars. One thing to look at is to see how ethno-nationalism is not a distinct or niche form of nationalism, but in contestation with other definitions and wider relations of power by the state.
Right.
You alluded to this, laws and the development of institutions, but ethnography, nationalism is very much connected to a dialogue on modernity and the political development of the state.
Okay. Yeah.
I would like to give you an opportunity to respond though, Saajid, as keep putting your comments in the chat, but Saajid, what are your comments at this time in response to Prof. Mohammed and in response to the two people who spoke in the chat?
Well, thanks for all of the feedback. I mean, I think a lot of what Professor Mohammed brought up are things that I've thought about here and there and some things that I haven't considered as yet. So I definitely will be taking all of that into advisement, and I think it will definitely enrich in my research. So thank you again, Professor Mohammed, for that. And yeah, ethno-nationalism, Amilka, is something that I want to continue working on and expanding on in terms of like, not just like in terms of my sources that I use to define it and stuff like that. So you talked about modernity and political development, and I'm thinking kind of back to Dr. Hosein's essay in the Islam in the Americas collection by Aisha Khan, where she talked about the Astra elections and how Muslim women were kind of barred from, political participation in that elections and whatnot, and how it was an opportunity for Muslim men, Indo-Muslim men, I guess, to engage with other patriarchies and other ethno-nationalist groups within the state, but also kind of like, not really give that opportunity to Muslim women, or at least not to the same extent. So yeah, that's definitely something I'm thinking about. I couldn't really incorporate that too much into the presentation itself, but I will develop on that. So thanks, Amilka, for bringing that up as well.
Thank you, Saajid. And Prof has another question for you. Go ahead, Prof.
Right. Sorry, this is a question this time. I know when you're doing a thesis, everybody says, do this and do that and do more. And I was afraid to say this one, but I thought, if you're looking at the perceptions of Islamic masculinity, one of the ways to get those perceptions is to have what other people say about it.
Okay.
And I thought, if at all possible, a focus group, control group, where you have comments from, a broad range. What Amilka thinks about Muslim men, for instance, or Islam, just get informed how Hindus see Muslim. And the thing is, if you do it for the contemporary, because this is a recent thing, you get that sense of how it is being perceived both at a global and local level. So I think that might be, sorry, what do you think?
I actually never thought of that, but come to think of it, I think it sounds like a good idea, because I mean, if I'm, a lot of my research is kind of like understanding Indo-Muslim men in relation to other groups in society, other ethno-religious groups, other people from different categories and groups. So maybe it would be useful to see to have an idea of how that relationship runs from the other side. I could probably get that from the literature as well, but it would be interesting to also bring that to the contemporary in terms of data extraction and whatnot. So I think that's a good idea, and I definitely will consider doing that for sure.
With that said,
perceptions are shaped, in fact, by how other people see you too.
Mm-hmm.
It is the dynamic that you need to create that a fluid sense of it rather than a fixity.
Right.
So that's
much
it.
to contemplate. Prof, thank you so much. Your comments are so much insight. Saajid, thank you for your responses. Thank you for those who are commenting in the chat and commented on the call. Our time is up. for this first seminar, what I would encourage you to do is to please add your comments before we close it off completely so that Saajid can benefit. You can also send messages to Saajid so that if you have any burning ideas that come to mind after the fact and you were not able to share, so he could benefit from your feedback as he works through his review of literature and his methodology. Thank you very much, Professor Mohammed, for all of your insights. Thank you to the supervisor, as well as to all of you who joined us this morning.